In 1943, the skies above Europe had become a hunting ground for death itself. Each dawn, as sunlight broke across the English coastline, hundreds of young American airmen made their way to the flight line. They climbed aboard the massive B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators, their silhouettes dark against the growing light. These were boys, really. Most hadn't yet turned 20. Farm kids who'd grown up pulling weeds and mending fences in Iowa cornfields. Factory workers from Detroit who'd left assembly lines for cockpits. College students from California who'd traded lecture halls for something far more dangerous. They pulled on their heavy flight suits, layers of insulation against temperatures that would freeze exposed skin in seconds at 25,000 feet. They carried small things, a rabbit's foot given by a sweetheart, photographs showing faces they hadn't seen in months, worn prayer cards folded into jacket pockets. They all knew what the odds meant. Before dawn, briefing rooms filled with tension so thick you could feel it in your chest. Maps emerged showing the day's target. Another industrial complex deep in German territory. Another oil refinery producing fuel for German war machines. Another rail yard moving troops and supplies to the front. Intelligence officers stood before the assembled crews and spelled out exactly what waited for them. Fighter squadrons positioned for interception, anti-aircraft batteries surrounding the target. Expected casualties listed with clinical precision. The crews absorbed every word in near silence, their jaws clenched, fingers tightening around coffee cups until knuckles went white. Each day brought hundreds of bombers roaring toward German industrial targets. Each day, dozens never returned. The ones who made it back told the same horrifying account of what awaited them in the skies above enemy territory. German Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s descended like swarms of furious wasps, diving through the bomber formations with cannon fire blazing. Wave after wave attacked, each assault more vicious than the last. They came head-on at the cockpit, trying to kill the pilots instantly. They hit from the sides in beam attacks, raking the fuselage with machine gun fire. They attacked from behind, where the tail gunner sat alone and exposed. Gunners fired back in desperation, their 50 caliber machine guns hammering out rounds. But the German pilots were veterans, experienced, incredibly skilled, fearless in their determination. These weren't rookies or conscripts. These were men who'd flown hundreds of missions, who knew exactly how a bomber moved, where it was vulnerable, how to exploit every weakness. They pressed attacks close enough that American gunners could see the faces behind enemy canopies. Some German pilots fired rockets directly into the formations. Others targeted the engines specifically, knowing a single burst of accurate fire could transform a four-engine bomber into a fireball that plummeted from the sky. Then there was the flak, anti-aircraft fire exploding in deadly black bursts that looked almost like dark flowers blooming against the blue sky, except each burst sent shrapnel in every direction, with enough velocity to tear through aluminum and steel. German gunners below had spent years perfecting their deadly craft. They understood the altitudes bombers flew. They'd calculated the speeds and practiced their trajectories until they could predict where a formation would be with mechanical precision. When a B-17 flew straight and level on its bombing run, it became the easiest target imaginable. The crews heard the shrapnel striking their aircraft, a horrifying sound like hail pounding on a tin roof, ping, 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 that echoed through every compartment. Sometimes shards of metal would rip through the fuselage, missing a man's head by inches. Sometimes they didn't miss. The sky itself seemed engineered to destroy them. Each bomber carried 10 men working in coordinated desperation. The pilot and co-pilot sat side by side in the cockpit, wrestling with heavy controls through sheets of flak and fighter attacks, every movement critical to keeping the aircraft flying. The navigator hunched over his charts and instruments, calculating courses in that cramped space, desperate to get them home. The bombardier lay prone in the nose, exposed and vulnerable during the most dangerous minutes of any mission, when the bomber had to fly straight and level toward the target. The flight engineer manned the top turret while also monitoring the engines. The radio operator kept contact with base control while serving as a waist gunner when needed. The ball turret gunner curled into a tiny sphere, suspended beneath the fuselage, spinning constantly to track fighters attacking from below. Two more waist gunners stood at open windows, firing through the freezing air at 40 degrees below zero, their fingers going numb despite the gloves. The tail gunner sat alone at the rear in the most dangerous position of all, watching for fighters approaching from behind with nowhere to hide. 10 men. They lived together, fought together, trusted each other completely with their lives, and far too often died together. When a bomber went down, it usually took all 10 men with it. Some managed to bail out before the aircraft exploded or came apart in the air. Those who parachuted down might become prisoners of war if fortune smiled on them. If it didn't, they were shot from the sky as they descended, or captured and executed by enraged civilians. Most never escaped the doomed aircraft. The losses defied comprehension. In October 1943 alone, during what bomber crews bitterly called Black Week, the 8th Air Force lost 148 bombers in just 7 days. 7 days, October 8th through October 14th, saw raids against Bremen, Ankloom, Marienburg, and Munster. Then came October 14th, what the crews would remember as Black Thursday, the second raid on Schweinfurt. On that single day, 60 B-17s were shot down in combat. 17 more were damaged so badly they never flew again. 600 men were lost in one mission. Just one day. The Schweinfurt raid became legendary for all the wrong reasons. The bombers flew deep into Germany without fighter escort because the P-47s and P-38s couldn't travel that far. The bombers were utterly alone. German fighters knew it, and they attacked in waves again and again for hours that felt like eternities. For the entire week, 148 bombers destroyed, nearly 13% of the attacking force, 1,500 airmen gone, killed, wounded, missing, or captured. 1,500 telegrams delivering the same dreaded message. We regret to inform you. 1,500 empty chairs at dinner tables back home. 1,500 young men who would never see their 25th birthday. And this was just 1 week. The typical bomber crew had a life expectancy of 11 missions. They were required to fly 25 missions before being sent home. 25 missions to complete a tour. 25 missions to survive. 25 missions before seeing family again. The mathematics were brutally simple. With an 11-mission life expectancy and a 25-mission requirement, only about 1 in 4 crews would statistically survive their tour. Fly enough missions and death became your likely outcome. Some crews beat these odds through extraordinary skill, incredible luck, or both. Many didn't. The empty bunks in the barracks told the story better than any statistics ever could. Each morning, crews walked to the flight line. By afternoon, some would never return. Those bunks would sit empty through the night. By the next morning, fresh replacements had moved in. New faces, new names. Young men who hadn't yet learned what the veterans understood in their bones, that most wouldn't finish their required 25 missions. Personal effects were packed up quickly. Wristwatches that would never mark another day. Letters from home. Family photographs. A teddy bear that one pilot had kept for luck. Everything was boxed and shipped back to families still hoping, still praying, not yet understanding their son was gone. More names kept getting added to the lengthening list of the dead and missing. The list grew longer every single week. Military leadership knew an urgent solution was essential. Bombers were being destroyed faster than factories back home could replace them. The assembly lines were running at maximum capacity, with new B-17s rolling off the production line every hour. Yet they couldn't replace losses fast enough. Something fundamental had to change, but finding the answer wasn't straightforward. They couldn't simply armor the planes like knights wore medieval armor. Weight was an enemy just as destructive as bullets and cannon fire. Every single pound mattered on a bomber. These aircraft were already operating at the absolute limits of what 1940s engineering could achieve. The 4 Wright Cyclone engines on each B-17 produced 1,200 horsepower each, which was impressive, but there were definite limits. Every pound of armor added meant 1 pound less bombs dropped on targets, or 1 pound less fuel for the journey home, or 1 pound less ammunition for defensive guns. Engineers ran these calculations constantly in desperate attempts to find the right balance. Add too much weight and the bomber couldn't reach operational altitude, making it vulnerable to fighters. Add too much weight and it couldn't carry enough fuel to reach Germany and return. Crews would have to ditch in the English Channel or crash land in occupied France. Add excessive armor in the wrong locations and the plane might not even achieve takeoff with a full bomb load. The engines would strain. The wings wouldn't generate sufficient lift. The aircraft would consume the entire runway and still not get airborne. But too little armor meant the current nightmare continued. Young men dying every single day, bombers spiraling down trailing flames and black smoke across European skies. Missions failing as formation after formation got shredded by German defenses that improved every week rather than diminishing. The balance was critical. Somewhere existed an optimal amount and strategic placement of armor that would save lives without destroying the bombers' ability to complete their missions. Someone had to figure out exactly where they could place limited armor to make the greatest difference. It seemed like a straightforward problem on the surface. Study where planes were getting hit. Armor those areas. Protect the vulnerable spots. Surely the military possessed the best engineers in the country working on this exact problem. They had combat veterans who'd actually flown these missions. They had designers who knew every rivet and bolt in these aircraft inside and out. They all reached the same obvious conclusion. The armor should go exactly where the planes were getting damaged. The answer seemed elementary. At Columbia University in Manhattan, just blocks away from the city's wartime energy humming through crowded streets, something extraordinary was taking shape. A secret group of mathematicians and statisticians were fighting the war with equations rather than bullets. They called themselves the Statistical Research Group, the SRG. These weren't ordinary academics. This was arguably the most brilliant collection of mathematical talent ever assembled under one roof. 18 researchers, each a specialist in their particular field, each bringing essential skills to an unprecedented mission. The atmosphere was unlike anything peacetime academia could produce. Urgency permeated everything. Every problem they solved could save lives. Every delay could mean additional deaths. Brilliant minds challenged each other daily at tables covered with data. Chalkboards filled with equations that looked like abstract art to outsiders, but were instruments of war to these men. Arguments erupted constantly over statistical methods, driven not by personal animosity, but by the passion of people understanding the stakes were life and death. Coffee flowed without stopping. Researchers worked deep into the night, sometimes sleeping in their offices because the work couldn't wait until morning. This wasn't the ivory tower of peacetime academia, where problems could wait for publication next year. This was urgent war work, classified, secret. Papers were stamped before being locked in safes. Visitors required security clearance. Work couldn't leave the building. Future Nobel Prize winners worked alongside the founders of modern statistics. Milton Friedman joined as associate director in 1943 and would later revolutionize economic theory. Harold Hotelling, one of the 3 charter members who'd helped establish the group, was already a legend in mathematical statistics. W. Alan Wallace directed daily research operations and kept work focused on practical military problems that could save American lives. And among these luminaries worked a quiet refugee from Austria, a man who'd escaped the Nazis by the thinnest possible margin. Someone who thought differently, who saw patterns others completely missed, who asked questions no one else had considered. His name was Abraham Wald. The SRG was part of the Applied Mathematics Panel, supported by the National Defense Research Committee. America was mobilizing every resource for winning this war, including its intellectual firepower. The group worked on hundreds of problems affecting all branches of military operations. Optimal pursuit curves for torpedoes, quality control for rocket fuel, sequential testing for ammunition. The work was incredibly diverse, highly technical, and critically important. Abraham Wald was born on October 31, 1902, in Kolozsvár, known now as Cluj, in Transylvania, then part of the Kingdom of Hungary. He grew up in a world of multiple cultures and competing languages. The city was a cultural crossroads where Hungarians, Romanians, Germans, and Jews lived together. Markets bustled with traders speaking different tongues. It was a rich cultural environment, but Wald's family was defined by something deeper than language or culture. They were deeply religious, observant Orthodox Jews who followed religious law strictly and lived by principles that set them apart from the majority around them. One specific commandment shaped his entire childhood: keep the Sabbath. From Friday evening when the first stars appear until Saturday evening when 3 stars can be seen, work is forbidden. No writing, no traveling, no cooking. In the Orthodox interpretation that Wold's family observed, this included attending school. The Hungarian school system had no flexibility whatsoever on this point. Classes ran 6 days weekly, including Saturdays. There was no exception for religious observance, no accommodation for Jewish students wanting to honor the Sabbath. The government had no interest in adjusting for religious minorities, so Wold's parents faced an impossible choice: send their son to school on Saturday and violate their deepest religious principles, compromising beliefs that defined their family, or keep him home and educate him themselves, accepting the risks and uncertainties of homeschooling. They chose their faith over convenience. Abraham Wold was homeschooled by his parents and older siblings from early childhood all the way through until he was ready for university. This could have been catastrophic. Homeschooling in the early 1900s, without modern resources or established curricula or support networks, was an enormous gamble. Many homeschooled children fell drastically behind their peers, and some never caught up at all. But Wold's parents were not ordinary people, and they didn't give their son an ordinary education. His father and older siblings provided rigorous, demanding education that would have challenged students in the finest schools available. Young Abraham showed immediate talent and passion for mathematics. Sciences were taught using whatever books and equipment they could obtain. Languages mattered in their multilingual city. Philosophy and logic trained his mind to think clearly and argue with precision. Religious studies maintained their traditions. The education was intense and focused entirely on one brilliant student who absorbed everything they taught him. By the time he was ready for university, Wold hadn't merely kept pace with formally schooled students, he'd surpassed them considerably. He'd mastered material that most students struggled desperately to understand. More importantly, he'd learned how to learn independently, to solve problems without a teacher guiding every single step, to think for himself. These skills proved more valuable than any conventional schooling could have provided. In 1923, at age 20, Wold enrolled at King Ferdinand I University in Cluj to study mathematics. The university recognized his preparation immediately. He excelled in every course. He graduated in 1928 with distinction. Then he made the decision that would define his career. He moved to Vienna, the intellectual capital of Central Europe, to pursue his doctorate. He studied at the University of Vienna under Karl Menger, himself a legendary mathematician pioneering entirely new fields. Wold earned his doctorate in 1931 with a dissertation on geometry that demonstrated remarkable originality. At 28 years old, he possessed a mind that sparkled with brilliance and creative fire. Abraham Wold saw patterns where others saw only chaos, understood connections invisible to everyone around him. Any top university across Europe would have eagerly sought him out, competed fiercely for his talents, offered him respected positions among their finest scholars. Yet this was Vienna during the 1930s, a time when Europe descended into gathering darkness. Hatred of Jewish people was spreading across the continent like poison seeping through soil, poisoning everything it touched. Even the most accomplished Jewish scholars faced relentless walls of prejudice. Universities imposed strict quotas, deliberately limiting how many Jewish faculty members they would permit. Departments openly and shamelessly refused to hire anyone Jewish, no matter their qualifications or achievements. The established academic world viewed Jews with deep suspicion and fear, treating them as foreign invaders, as dangers to be eliminated. And Abraham Wold, armed with his doctorate and undeniable genius, could not obtain a university position. He submitted applications, they came back rejected. He tried again, only to receive the same answer. Not because his research fell short or his theories were flawed, but simply because of who he was. Unable to pursue his true calling in academia, Wold worked as a private mathematics tutor for Karl Schlesinger, a prominent Vienna banker. The work provided steady income and reasonable compensation, but it represented an enormous waste of his extraordinary mind. Everything changed when Oskar Morgenstern, director of the Austrian Institute for Business Cycle Research, recognized what Wald truly possessed. Rather than merely offering sympathy, Morgenstern created an actual economics position specifically for him. This was no charitable gesture. Morgenstern possessed the eye of someone who recognized genuine talent immediately. Wald began channeling his mathematical precision and creative thinking into economic questions, bringing the same intellectual rigor to this unfamiliar field that he had previously devoted to geometry. His contributions accumulated, his published papers circulated among economists. His reputation grew steadily within that professional circle. Yet academia's doors remained sealed against him. The university appointment he deserved still frustratingly out of reach. Then March 1938 arrived. The catastrophe that Austrian Jews had long dreaded, though some still harbored hope might never materialize, finally descended upon them. Nazi Germany, swollen with confidence from years of territorial expansion, turned its full attention toward Austria. On the morning of March 12th, German troops poured across the border, meeting virtually no organized resistance. Austrians lined the streets, many cheering wildly, raising their arms in Nazi salutes, welcoming the occupation. By March 13th, the annexation became official. Austria vanished as an independent nation, absorbed into the German Reich. For Austria's Jewish population, this represented far more than a political realignment. It meant existential danger. The Nazi regime immediately enacted its racial laws with passionate support from countless Austrians. Jewish professionals lost their positions within days. Businesses they had built were seized or destroyed. People were attacked in streets and public places, while police either watched passively or participated in the violence. Synagogues fell victim to vandalism and desecration. The persecutions that had unfolded gradually in Germany accelerated dramatically in Austria, compressed into weeks rather than years. Abraham Wald understood instantly what awaited him. He grasped that this represented no temporary upheaval, but the beginning of something far darker, something that would intensify rather than improve. Remaining meant imprisonment or death. That summer of 1938, just months after the Anschluss, he made the wrenching decision to flee toward America. He abandoned nearly everything he possessed: his home, his professional position, his carefully built network of colleagues and peers. Most painfully of all, he left behind his parents, his brothers and sisters, the broader web of extended family. The mathematics simply did not work out. Not everyone could obtain exit visas. Escape routes had limited capacity. Someone had to stay behind. He vowed to retrieve them once he established himself, to arrange their passage to safety. He promised they would be reunited. He never saw most of them again. Of the 9 family members who remained in Austria, all but one would eventually perish in Auschwitz. His parents, his siblings, the people who had nurtured his mind and shaped his character and believed in his potential, vanished into the genocidal machinery. Abraham Wald, alive and relatively safe in America, would spend his remaining decades carrying the weight of survivors' guilt. In 1938, the Cowles Commission for Research in Economics, then based in Colorado Springs, invited Wald to join as a research fellow. After a brief period there, by September 1938, he relocated to Columbia University in New York, arriving as a Carnegie Corporation Fellow under the guidance of Harold Hotelling. Columbia would become his permanent home. He advanced from associate professor to full professor, earning a permanent faculty position at last. Finally, after years of systematic discrimination and forced displacement, he arrived where he truly belonged, engaged in teaching and research, developing innovative mathematics. When World War II erupted, America mobilized not only its factories and military units, but also its intellectual resources. The Statistical Research Group was formally established at Columbia University on July 1, 1942, continuing operations through 1945. 18 researchers worked there, supported by approximately 30 young women who performed the computational labor, most of them mathematics graduates from Hunter College. The SRG confronted life and death problems, but one challenge stood out as desperately urgent: the bomber problem. Allied bombers were being destroyed at rates that could not be sustained indefinitely. Military leadership desperately needed guidance on where protective armor should be added. The question seemed straightforward enough. Where are bullets and shrapnel hitting the planes? Reinforce those locations. Engineers examined returning bombers by the hundreds, studying aircraft that came back from missions across Europe. Technical teams met each plane as it landed, rushing to document damage before crews could even complete their debriefing. They worked methodically, marking every bullet hole, every shrapnel wound, every section of torn aluminum, every damaged system. They measured each hole's dimensions and recorded locations with precision. Multiple photographs captured the damage from different angles. Back at headquarters, they assembled this intelligence into comprehensive diagrams. B-17 and B-24 silhouettes emerged covered densely with dots, each marking where projectiles or fragments had struck the aircraft. Patterns crystallized after examining hundreds of bombers. The evidence remained consistent regardless of bomb groups, target locations, or mission types. The fuselage bore extensive damage, riddled with holes ranging from small machine gun punctures to large cannon shell tears. Wings showed similarly heavy damage, concentrated especially near where they joined the fuselage. Control surfaces, including ailerons and elevators, were frequently pocked with penetrations. Tail sections displayed severe damage, both vertical and horizontal stabilizers showing signs of repeated pounding. Yet the engines presented a puzzling contrast. They showed relatively minimal damage. Yes, some hits had occurred, but nothing approaching the scale of fuselage or wing damage. The cockpit similarly displayed limited damage, with scattered hits, but nothing comparable to what the fuselage sustained. The fuel systems, surprisingly, appeared relatively unscathed. The fuel tanks bore less damage than anyone might have expected. Engineers compiled their statistics and constructed bar charts and diagrams, calculating what percentage of returning aircraft displayed damage to each component. The fuselage, wings, and tail dominated the charts. The engines, cockpit, and fuel systems clustered at the bottom. The conclusion appeared self-evident, obvious to the point of being simple. Reinforce the areas taking the heaviest hits. Armor the fuselage where most damage concentrated. Strengthen the wings enduring repeated fighter attacks. Protect the tail section that sustained consistent impacts. These represented the genuine vulnerabilities clearly demonstrated by the evidence. The engineers forwarded their proposal to the statistical research group for routine verification. The statisticians would check the numbers, confirm the findings, and then implementation would proceed. It should have been straightforward, requiring just a few days for analysis before approval and production. But Abraham Wald examined the data and perceived something everyone else had overlooked. Seated in a conference room alongside engineers and military officers and fellow statisticians from the SRG, Wald studied the diagrams laid across the table. Bomber silhouettes covered with damage indicators. Every person present looked at the identical information, observed the identical patterns. Every person except Wald. He examined the diagrams intensely, asking detailed questions about data collection methodology, about which specific aircraft were being examined, about procedures. Then he posed a question so elementary yet so transformative that it redirected everything. A question that seemingly anyone should have considered, yet mysteriously no one had. Where are the planes with engine damage? The question hung suspended in the air between them. The men exchanged glances, confused. What precisely did he mean? The numbers clearly demonstrated that engines sustained less damage. They could all see it right there. But Wald pressed further. These diagrams represent only the planes that returned. What about the planes that never came back? Where were those aircraft struck? What damage patterns did they display? How were they destroyed? Everyone else perceived the returning planes and identified vulnerability patterns. Wald perceived the returning planes and recognized a critical bias, an enormous and overlooked distortion that had escaped everyone's notice. These represented survivors. These were the fortunate ones, the aircraft that made it home despite their wounds. But what of the planes that never returned? Where were they damaged? What killed them? The engineers had been analyzing a severely compromised sample without recognizing the flaw. They studied exclusively aircraft that survived combat and successfully returned to England. The shot-down planes remained unavailable for examination, scattered across European territory, crashed in German fields, burning in French forests, sunk in the English Channel, shattered at altitude. Their damage patterns could never be recorded. Their crews could never report what destroyed them. That data simply did not exist. It was gone, vanished, lost permanently. Yet that absent data held the greatest importance. Wald grasped something fundamental about how the information had been collected. When returning planes showed heavy damage to the fuselage, wings and tail, this conveyed something quite specific. It indicated these areas could absorb tremendous punishment and still permit the aircraft to return safely. A B-17 could sustain dozens of fuselage penetrations and continue flying. The crew might experience terror, wounded personnel might be bleeding throughout the cabin, but the machine remained controllable, the engines kept functioning, the pilots could maneuver it home. Wings damaged, certainly serious, potentially catastrophic, but not always fatal. The B-17's wings were enormous structures with multiple main beams and reinforcing ribs. Substantial damage could be inflicted before wing failure occurred structurally. Bombers could survive impacts in those areas. This represented what the data genuinely conveyed. Not that these areas required protection because they were vulnerable, but rather that these areas could tolerate injury without bringing down the aircraft. Yet the engines revealed minimal damage on returning planes. Why would that be? Not because engines were somehow immune or harder to strike. Wald reasoned, drawing on confirmed evidence from combat analysis, that German fighters and anti-aircraft artillery targeted the entire aircraft. Projectile impacts distributed fairly randomly across the bomber, with no reason to imagine engines possessed magical protection or presented smaller targets. They were substantial, obvious objectives hanging from the wings. Fighters specifically pursued them. Anti-aircraft fire exploded nearby. So why would returning bombers show such limited engine damage? The explanation was deeply disturbing. Returning planes showed limited engine damage precisely because planes struck in the engines did not return. They fell from the sky. Engine damage could initiate a fire that defied extinguishing. The high-octane aviation fuel fed the inferno mercilessly. Flames expanded. The engine fractured apart, pieces flying free, potentially destroying the wing or starting additional fires. Alternatively, the strike destroyed the engine completely and instantaneously. With one engine lost, pilots might limp home only if they remained relatively close to base. With two engines destroyed on the same wing, the plane became unmanageable, rolling over and plunging earthward. The cockpit followed identical logic. Returning planes exhibited limited cockpit damage, not because it represented a minor or particularly protected target. The cockpit sat right forward where fighters most loved making head-on approaches, the entire nose constructed from transparent panels. Pilots sat plainly visible. Enemy fighters deliberately aimed at them, attempting to kill the crew operating the machine. So why did returning planes display restricted cockpit damage? Because planes receiving direct cockpit hits, when bullets pierced through and killed the pilot and co-pilot, or wounded them so severely they could not control the aircraft, did not return home. They descended. The crew perished. The fuel systems revealed the identical pattern. Fuel tanks carried hundreds of gallons of high-octane aviation fuel. One tracer round, one incendiary shell, one fragment of hot shrapnel striking a fuel tank could transform the entire bomber into a mobile inferno. Crews employed the term "cooking off" for this catastrophe. The plane would ignite, flames spreading instantaneously through the fuel vapor in an unstoppable wave. The moment those bombers took flak, the crews had only heartbeats to decide. Jump or stay. For most, there was no decision to make at all. When fuel systems ruptured under enemy fire, when the tanks burned like torches, there was no time for escape. Those planes became fireballs above German soil. Others limped back across the channel, crippled and smoking, only to plunge into the dark water below. They never made it home. The damage patterns on the planes that returned told a deceptive story. Engineers looked at the returning bombers and saw something that felt obvious. The fuselage showed bullet holes. The wings were scarred with shrapnel. The tail section bore the marks of combat. Here, they thought, is where armor is needed, But this visible damage held a dangerous secret. The very absence of engine damage on surviving planes was not proof that engines were tough. It was proof that engines, once hit, meant death. The crews never came back to report a damaged engine. The planes simply vanished. Similarly, planes that returned with intact cockpits told a chilling truth. Cockpit damage was fatal. The pilots who flew through flak with damaged controls never landed anywhere. They crashed, and their aircraft became wrecks in foreign fields. And those fuel tanks, unblemished on the returning bombers, they only looked invulnerable because the planes carrying damaged fuel systems exploded mid-air or burned in the channel. The evidence was hiding in plain sight, but only if you knew how to read it. Abraham Wald saw something the engineers had missed. He recognized a statistical trap so fundamental, so pervasive, that it would reshape how scientists think about data forever. He called it survivorship bias. When you only study what survives, you blind yourself to the most important information. You study the winners and forget the losers. You examine the successful strategies and ignore the thousands of identical strategies that led to bankruptcy. You see only the data that remains visible, filtered by a brutal selection process that erases the failures. The missing data points are not absent by chance. They are absent because they failed in systematic ways directly connected to what you are trying to understand. When an aircraft gets hit in the fuel system, it does not return for inspection. When a pilot takes shrapnel to the cockpit, there is no damage report to file. Those missing cases, those absent data points, they contain the most crucial lessons of all. Wald's insight cut against everything the military engineers assumed. He told them that the damage they could see was misleading them. The armor should not go where the holes were most numerous on returning planes. It should go where the holes were entirely absent. Put protection on the engines, reinforce the cockpit, strengthen the fuel systems. These were the vulnerable points. These were where hits meant no return. This was counterintuitive. It contradicted the obvious reading of the visible evidence. But Wald was right, and the engineers were about to make a catastrophic error. They were preparing to weight down aircraft with armor in all the wrong places, leaving the truly critical systems exposed. Bombers would become heavier, less nimble, able to carry fewer bombs and fuel. And crews would keep dying, because the protection would be concentrated where survival was already possible. Wald translated this insight into technical memoranda for the Statistical Research Group. These were not simple documents. They contained sophisticated mathematics, statistical proofs, equations that required advanced training to pass. He developed methods to estimate the complete picture of damage distribution by working backwards from biased data. He had to mathematically infer what the unshot-down planes would have shown if they could speak. The work was classified for security. The enemy could not learn how American operational research was making bombers harder to kill. The papers remained locked away long after the war ended, finally seeing daylight in the late 1970s. Only then could researchers examine the original technical memoranda in full detail and understand the mathematical elegance of Wald's reasoning. The Statistical Research Group operated under strict boundaries. Wald and his colleagues were analysts, not commanders. They were tasked with examining data and providing insights. The final decisions belonged to military officers who understood aircraft design, production capabilities, and operational needs. So the memoranda presented the statistical analysis cleanly. They showed what the data implied, but they stopped short of ordering specific actions. The implications were unmistakable to anyone reading carefully, but the choice of what to do belonged to those with command authority. Military leadership embraced Wald's methods through the remainder of the war. His approach became standard procedure for assessing battle damage. The principle he established took root in military institutions and remained embedded in operational research for decades. When the Korean War came and new aircraft required armor assessment, Wald's methods were consulted. When Vietnam brought helicopter survivability into focus, his framework was applied. Every time the military faced decisions about protecting aircraft, vehicles, or personnel, Wald's statistical thinking guided the analysis. Officers learned at military academies and war colleges to think the way he thought. to see not just the visible data, but the invisible data concealed by survivorship. Yet Wald's contribution extended far beyond bomber armor. He had identified one of the most fundamental principles in all of statistics and critical thinking. Survivorship bias was not merely a military problem. It was a universal human blind spot. In business, executives study successful companies like pilgrims seeking wisdom. They read case studies of brilliant strategies, bold decisions that paid off spectacularly. They learn from CEOs who took enormous risks and won vast fortunes. But for every visionary whose risk-taking multiplied billions, there were dozens whose identical risk-taking ended in bankruptcy and ruin. The failed CEOs do not write memoirs. Their companies are gone. They are the planes that did not return. Because we only study the survivors, because the failures are invisible, we draw dangerously false conclusions. We believe that the winning strategies must work, never realizing that survivorship bias is showing us a distorted picture. In medicine, hospital-based clinical trials suffer from survivorship bias, just as military analysts studied returning bombers. When researchers only examine patients who survived long enough to reach medical care, they miss the most severe cases. The patients who died before arrival, who collapsed at home or on the street, they are not in the data. This systematic exclusion of the worst cases leads to underestimating how deadly diseases truly are. It produces wrong conclusions about which treatments actually work. The sample appears to show better outcomes than reality, because the most tragic outcomes have been erased from observation. In finance, mutual funds that collapse from poor performance vanish from the historical record. When investors evaluate average fund returns, they see only the funds that survived. The closed funds, the dead funds, they are gone from the database. This causes performance statistics to be inflated by an estimated 1 to 2% annually. Over decades, this seemingly small distortion compounds into enormous differences in retirement savings. The failures are not there to remind us that most funds underperform. We only count the winners. Wald posed an uncomfortable question that goes against natural human thinking. What am I not seeing? What data is missing? What failures am I ignoring because they are simply not present to be counted? These questions demand a particular kind of mental discipline. You must look at what is in front of you while simultaneously imagining what is absent. You must analyze the data you possess while also analyzing the data you cannot access. Most people cannot manage this double vision naturally. Wald could. It was his greatest intellectual gift. After the war, Wald carried his revolutionary thinking forward at Columbia University. He was now recognized as one of America's leading statisticians, his wartime work having demonstrated the power of rigorous mathematical thinking applied to urgent real-world problems. In 1947, he published a book that would reshape statistics itself. Sequential analysis grew directly from his wartime research on military operations. The methodology had been classified during the war because of its strategic implications. After hostilities ended, Wald refined and expanded his ideas into a complete theoretical framework that transcended military applications. The book, published by John Wiley & Sons in New York and Chapman & Hall in London, revolutionized how scientists and engineers designed experiments and made decisions. Traditional statistical methods required you to fix your sample size in advance. You would measure exactly 100 subjects or inspect exactly 1,000 components. Only after collecting the entire predetermined sample would you analyze the results together. This approach wasted resources dramatically. Often you could reach a confident conclusion with far less data, yet the rigid methodology forced you to collect the full sample regardless. Wald showed how to make reliable decisions with less data by analyzing results as they accumulated. You could stop gathering information the moment you had sufficient evidence for a confident conclusion. This saved time, it saved money, it saved materials. In medical trials, it meant effective treatments could be identified faster and harmful treatments could be halted sooner, preventing unnecessary suffering. The methodology he developed became standard practice across countless fields. Drug trials, testing new medications, quality control on factory floors, industrial testing of materials and components. Anywhere decisions had to be made under uncertainty, and the expense of data collection mattered, Wald's sequential analysis changed how work was conducted. By 1950, Abraham Wald had become one of the world's most respected statisticians. He had transformed multiple fields. He had trained students who would carry his methods forward into their own careers and institutions. He had proven that pure mathematical reasoning could address real-world challenges and preserve lives. That year brought an invitation from India. The Indian government asked him to lecture on statistics. Wald was scheduled to speak before the Indian Science Congress in Bangalore and to visit the Indian Statistical Institute in Calcutta. He arrived in India in November 1950 with his wife Lucille. Their two children, Betty and Robert, remained in the United States. The journey was planned for several months. Wald expected to return to Colombia in mid-February. On December 13, 1950, Wald and his wife boarded an Air India flight. The aircraft was a Douglas C-47, registration VT-CFK. The plane was traveling from Bombay to Trivandrum with a scheduled stop in Madras. It was a routine commercial flight, ordinary and expected to be safe. But something went terribly wrong over southern India. Near the town of Kotagiri in the Nilgiri Mountains, the aircraft struck the mountainside. The pilots encountered terrain they did not see until impact was imminent. The plane crashed in a rocky valley far below, near Rangaswamy Peak, roughly 8 miles from Kotagiri at approximately 6,000 feet. All 21 people aboard perished instantly, 17 passengers and 4 crew members. Recovery teams did not find the wreckage for an entire week. The mountainous terrain was too severe for bodies to be transported. They were laid to rest at the crash site, high in the Nilgiris. Abraham Wald was 48 years old. The mathematical community was devastated. Obituaries appeared in journals worldwide. Colleagues wrote tributes. Oscar Morgenstern honored him in econometrics publications. The Indian Statistical Institute held a memorial service. Colombia mourned the loss of one of its most brilliant minds. But his legacy proved eternal. His wartime papers continued shaping military strategy for decades to come. Every time military planners needed to make decisions about protecting vehicles or aircraft, they returned to Wald's work. His methods were taught at military academies and war colleges. Officers learned to think the way he thought. His concept of survivorship bias became one of the most important ideas in statistics, decision theory, and critical thinking. It is now standard material in statistics classes, business schools, medical training programs, and social science curricula. Wherever people must understand how biased samples can lead reasoning astray, Wald's insight appears. More than 70 years after Wald completed his analysis, survivorship bias continues affecting how we understand success and failure across virtually every domain of human activity. When we study winners, we must remember all the losers absent from view. When we examine survivors, we must think about those who did not survive. When we observe data, we must ask what data is missing. In business, survivorship bias creates a completely distorted picture of what actually works. We study successful companies and consume case studies about their brilliant moves. We learn from CEOs who took bold risks and reaped enormous rewards. But for every visionary whose gamble produced billions, there were dozens whose identical gamble led to ruin. Those failed CEOs do not appear on podcasts. They do not write best-selling books. Their companies are gone from the marketplace. They are the missing planes, and because we only see the survivors, we reach false conclusions about what strategies work. We never recognize that survivorship bias is concealing all the failures. In medicine, studies limited to hospital patients miss the most severe cases. The people who died before reaching medical help are not included in the data. This produces systematic underestimation of how dangerous conditions are and leads to wrong conclusions about which treatments actually save lives. Hospital-based research sees only survivors, just like military engineers studying bombers that returned. In finance, mutual funds that closed because of losses disappear from performance comparisons. When you look at average fund returns, you only see the funds that survived. The dead funds are erased from history. This inflates performance numbers by an estimated 1 to 2% annually. Across decades, this distortion creates massive differences in retirement accounts and wealth accumulation. Every success story masks countless failures. Every survivor represents many who did not survive. Every data point you can observe exists alongside innumerable data points you cannot see. Wald taught us a way of thinking that goes beyond military applications. He taught us to question our samples, to ask whether what we observe is truly representative or biased, to consider selection effects, to think carefully about what process generated the data we can access and what that process might be hiding. In 1943, young men climbed into bombers each morning, not knowing if they would see another sunset. The military examined the damage patterns and saw what appeared to be obvious solutions. They saw punctured fuselages and scarred wings and damaged tail sections. The data seemed clear. The answer appeared evident. They were preparing to armor exactly the wrong parts of their aircraft. But Abraham Wald examined that same data and perceived something different. He saw the planes that were not there. He saw the missing bullet holes. He saw the invisible truth concealed within plain sight. He asked the question that nobody else considered. Where are the planes with engine damage? Why do they not return? What does their absence teach us? It was not magic or intuition. It was rigorous thinking. It was sophisticated mathematics, applied with imagination, and perception. It was intellectual courage to challenge assumptions everyone else had accepted without question. And because he looked beyond the obvious, because he questioned what others took for granted, because he asked about what was missing, rather than merely analyzing what was present, his insight helped shield American aircrews flying into danger. Not through superior weapons, not through better tactics, but through clear thinking, through asking the right question. That is Abraham Wald's true legacy. Not merely his mathematical brilliance, though that was extraordinary. Not simply his groundbreaking contributions to statistics and operational research, though those transformed entire fields. His deepest legacy is teaching us to see what is not there, teaching us that the most important data is frequently the data we cannot collect, teaching us that the most valuable lessons emerge from the failures that did not survive to instruct us. In a room filled with brilliant minds, Abraham Wald was the one who asked the different question. He was the one who looked past the obvious. He was the mathematician who perceived what others overlooked. And in perceiving it, in that single crucial insight about missing data and survivorship bias, he changed how we think about evidence itself. He gave us a tool for preventing systematic errors in our reasoning. He showed us that sometimes the most important thing present is the thing that is absent. The bullet holes marked the planes that came home. But the lesson, the profound and enduring lesson, was written in the planes that did not. In the missing data, in the invisible truth. Abraham Wald taught us to look for the missing planes, to ask about what is not there, to see the invisible. And that lesson continues to preserve lives more than 70 years later.